Hi everyone, welcome to the Culinary Institute of America. My name is Robert Tremblay. I'm the Associate Director of Admissions here at the college, as well as a 2010 graduate. And today we're going to be working with onions, which I know isn't the most exciting ingredient when we kind of look at it on the surface, but in terms of the onion, it's really one of the most versatile and popular ingredients that you're going to use within the world of food. So when we look at the onion itself, it actually comes from the lily family, which I know is a flower, which there are tulips that come out of the lily family and other variations that way, but botanically speaking, it is actually coming from the lily family. So perfect example here is taking a look at this Spanish onion that I have here. When we talk about its growth process, this bulb is actually what sits in the ground, and it actually has a green leaf that comes out on top, which is how farmers identify its doneness and its ripeness. But really, when we talk about this ingredient, it's one of the most versatile that we come in contact with. There are two variations that at the CIA, that's how we differentiate the type of onions that we're using. They come in a fresh form, which is any of the green varietals. When we talk about leeks, we talk about ramps, or we talk about actual green onion scallions. But when we talk about the actual dry onion, we're talking about a much different area of the ingredient. The Spanish onion that I have here is a variation of that, and you can tell the differentiation because it's got a dry skin to the outside of it. Similar ingredients are garlic, shallots. We also work with small pearl onions, red onions, all those different variations that come with a dry outer shell. That's how we know we're working with a dry ingredient. Now, the important areas of understanding that differentiation is with not just understanding the flavor profiles and the way that we're going to utilize them in the cooking process, but also in how we're going to store them. So when we actually use a fresh onion, what we want to do is keep it in a cool, moist environment. So storing them in a refrigerator unit, keeping them in that type of area so that they retain their moisture and that they're not going to dry out on us. We want that freshness to stay inside them. When we talk about the dry onions, we want to store them not only in the containers they came in, but we want to keep them in a cool, dark place. And a cool, dry place is a very important thing because we, again, want to keep them in their dry state. Now, the reason why I say that you want to keep them in the storage units that they actually come in is because, as you know from working with them and eating with them, they're very pungent, so they're going to leave a lasting impression on whatever you keep them in. So if you store them in a plastic container or work with them that way, they're going to retain that smell in the item that you put it in. So always best to try to store your onions in the same container that they come in. So there's 1,000,001 different ways that we learn how to use onions here at the college, and whether it's just doing knife cuts or working with them as simple aromatics, today we're going to use onions in a way that really brings them to the front of our palates and really makes them the star of the show. So we're going to be making a fairly traditional classic French onion soup, which is one of my all-time favorite foods. We're going to do a little bit of a different variation today, but I'll talk you through all those different steps. But I'm going to show you our ingredients that we're going to be using today. So as I was introducing the onions earlier, we're going to be using a medium-sized Spanish onion today, but we're doing them in thin slices. So I'll take you through the steps on how to slice them in just a bit, but really it's about getting nice, thin, even, uniform slices on our onions. Very important part to that process. So in addition to the Spanish onions we're going to use some whole unsalted butter. We have some minced garlic, which will be an additional aromatic. We're going to be using some dry red wine as well. Now, traditionally, most French onion soups are going to call for some form of sherry to go in. Personally, I prefer the use of red wine just because it's a little bit more versatile ingredient. You can use it for a lot more different applications, and it allows you to buy more of it, which makes it a little bit cheaper. If you don't want to use alcohol at all, one really good substitute for the red wine in this dish could actually be pomegranate juice, which I know sounds a little bit weird and kind of out there, but if you're in a setting where you're not able to use wine or purchase wine for whatever reason, using pomegranate juice and reducing it down will give a nice pungent flavor that really takes on some of those nice characteristics that we traditionally get from the wine being incorporated to a dish like this. In addition, we also have some dry bay leaves, which we're going to add in at the very end while we simmer it, and then at the very end, probably the best part of the whole onion soup is the gratin that goes on top. So we're actually going to be toasting our own croutons and adding a big heaping pile of Gruyere cheese that we're going to melt and brown and make it all bubbly and delicious on top. So now that we've got our ingredients gone through, what I want to do is show you how to slice the onion properly. Now, I've seen a lot of young chefs looking at the process of cutting an onion, and there's a million and one different ways of doing it that I've seen, but there's really only one way that we do it at the CIA, so I want to talk you through that process. And so we'll bring you in nice and close, kind of show you a little bit of the anatomy of the onion and kind of the best way to approach it. As you can see on the top side, we have the root element, and then we also have the pointed end here. Really what we want to do is take off those ends. Underneath each side of this, we're going to have the core of the onion, which we don't want to include in our food, so we want to cut that off. But we also want to get off the peel of the onion as easily as possible. Now, I've already removed a lot of the dry, crinkly sides of the onion and that skin. So you want to get as much of that off as possible before you start to cut it, because it'll just help maintain some cleanliness on your cutting board and make the process a little bit easier. So all I'm going to do is cut off both of the top ends, or the top end and the bottom end, however you want to look at it. Okay. Perfect. So we'll just put that off to the side. And so now we're going to slice it in half. Now, I have seen a number of people attack an onion by cutting it this way and going about it that process. That's not how you want to do it. You want to cut it down straight through the middle, but you want to come in from the top and do it from this perspective. So that way, the important element to this is really the structure of the onion itself. As you can see, these lines here, that will be a little bit easier to see once I get the peel off. But you can see how much easier it comes off when you take off the tops. So what we have here, you can see the lines, hopefully, these indentations. This is what we want to cut along. The reason that we're going to do this is because it's going to really make the onions that much more tender. If we were going to take the onion and cut it down this way, and I'll do kind of an example of sort of the wrong way to do it. If we cut down the onion this way, and I've seen a number of places that have done this. I've worked in restaurants where they taught us to cut it this way, but what this is going to do is it's going to make the onions very tough and really, not very pleasant. As well, you're cutting through more of the cell walls of the onion, and that's what's going to cause you to tear up. So not only is the way that you store the product and using it fresh going to limit the amount of tears that come out of your eyes, but also using a sharp knife and coming at it from the correct direction. So to get our nice thin slices on our onions, all we're going to do is we're going to follow those lines as I talked about. Let those be your guide. And you want to use your fingers as your guiding force. I know it can be a little bit intimidating at first to try to dive into the cutting process, and you want to feel like you need to keep your hands away from everything, but it's really about taking control of your food and guiding it through from the very beginning. So we're going to start here on our one side. And really the best way to go about it is you want to follow the contours of the onion. So instead of just coming down straight here and going across, we're going to have odd shapes when we talk about the onion. We want uniformity. So we're going to follow the contours of the onion itself and come in sort of at an angle on the side. And we're just going to cut along those lines. Now you really want them to be about 1/4 of an inch in diameter, so not much thicker than that. You can make them thicker if you want to. It's just going to take a little bit longer for them to cook. But what our main concern here is the uniformity of them. The reason for that is we want them to cook at the same pace. We don't want to have some of our onions going longer and some of them being faster. We want them to caramelize and brown at a consistent pace. So once you get to about halfway, that's when you can rotate the onion to the other side and take it on through. So just to show you again on the other half of our onion, again, we're following the lines and we're following the contour of the onion itself. I want to go in with the front tip of the knife. That's what we have actually the most control over. So we're just going to follow it up. Let the knife blade actually rest against your finger. That's what we want to do. You want to keep that middle finger out adjacent from the rest of your hand, and so that way you protect the blade from actually coming in contact with your finger, and you're able to maintain even knife cuts on all the way through the onion. Again, once you get about halfway through, you can rotate it and take it to the other side. Just like that. Got beautifully thin slices on our onions to go with the rest of the onions that we have over here. So I'm just going to get our final prep work into the bowl. Now for this recipe, we're going to be doing about half a gallon of soup. So we're gonna need roughly 2 pounds or so of onions, give or take a few. So for this, it only took about five medium-sized Spanish onions to do. So what I like to do is when you go to the grocery store or wherever you're gonna buy your ingredients, just try to gauge it based upon the size of the container that it comes in, how much it weighs initially, and then just try to eyeball it from there. It doesn't necessarily need to be perfect, especially for this type of dish. The more onions you have, usually the better it's going to be. So, but for this ratio, typically for about a gallon of stock, you're gonna want to have about 4 pounds of onions to go with it. So we're gonna do about half that today. All right, so now that we've got our onions all prepped and ready to go, we can actually start to begin building our soup. So first and foremost, the biggest step in this process is really the caramelization of our onions. So the whole idea behind this is to get our onions, all that delicious sugar, all those aromatic flavors, we want to cook those down. We want to condense them all and really make a nice, thick, hearty, robust flavor profile for the start of our soup. So think of this onion and the caramelizing of it as a concentrate, as a flavor that we're just going to dump in the bottom of our pan and build from there. So we have to build these slowly. We don't want to have our pan on too high a temperature. So I'm going to get some whole butter into the pan, not too much. You don't want a lot because the butter is actually going to provide moisture into the pan, and moisture is going to be the death of the Maillard reaction. So when we talk about the Maillard reaction, we're literally looking to cook those sugars that are in our onions and get them to caramelize against the heat of the pan and cooking down those proteins. So it's a very important process to make sure that your temperature isn't too high, so that way we aren't burning our onions or that we're cooking those sugars. So no higher than medium heat. We really want to stay low and slow with this and really take the time to cook these down properly. So our pan's coming up nicely. I'm just going to go ahead and add our onions in. So you can see there are a lot of onions in here. It seems like a ridiculous amount of onion to put in here, but after we cook these down for about 30 minutes, and yes, that's how long it's going to take to cook these down properly and get them caramelized, it's going to really reduce in its volume, and it's going to intensify its flavor. So I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of salt here, not too much, because an important thing with this is to note that, as I've said before, salt pulls out moisture from these ingredients, and onions have a ton of moisture in them, and that moisture is going to reduce our ability to brown the onions and get that caramelization that we're looking for. So very limited on the seasoning. The main seasoning that we're going to have for this is going to come from the seasoning of the stock that we're going to add to it a little bit later on. But really an important thing here is to get our onions into the pan and let them do their thing. Simply put, if you move them around, they're not going to get the chance to cook and caramelize. So we're going to move them around a little bit just so that we can get cooking on all the onions. But best thing that you can do is let the onions sit and let them do their thing. Our onions have really cooked down a lot. If you remember from the start of everything, how the pan or our pot was filled nearly halfway with onions. Now they've cooked down to really a nice caramelized state. I still want to take these a bit further. When you think about this dish, you really want to get a jam-like consistency in your mind when you're talking about the cooking down of these onions. We've got some great caramelization, some great fond developing on the bottom of the pan, which is going to really incorporate a lot of flavor, but we want to just take these down a little bit more, just to really kind of finish off that caramelization, add some more of that sweetness and really that rich caramel type flavor to our soup. So this concentration, these flavors are what's going to build all the way through the rest of our ingredients. All right, so our onions have been caramelized. They've been cooked down to really that jam type consistency. It smells fantastic in here. I'm like truly wishing you all could smell what it smells like here in this room. But our next step, since we've got that caramelization, we developed all that fond on the bottom of the pan, now we're gonna go ahead and deglaze the pan. And to do that, we're gonna use our dry red wine. Okay. And so we've got about half a cup or so of red wine that we've added to this. And what we wanna do here is we're gonna turn up our heat a bit. And so what the deglazing of the pan is going to do is it's actually going to pull up all those brown bits that we've got going on in the bottom of the pan. And what we want to do next is actually reduce this down and concentrate it. So we almost want to cook the wine to the point where it's a syrupy type consistency. Really, like I've said before and used this word several times already, but it's really about concentrating those flavors and really building a strong base for the stock that we're going to add in just a little bit. All right, so our wine is cooking down really nicely. Just want to take a little bit of time to talk about the stock that we're going to be using today. We've actually got some in-house made brown veal stock, which we're going to be using for the broth for the soup, but you can use any number of different variations for the stock. You could use white beef broth if you wanted to, chicken stock, you could use a vegetarian stock if you wanted to keep it traditionally vegetarian. However, in the traditional application, it's usually going to be some type of either white beef stock or straight veal stock. So that's what we've got on hand today, and I've already got it warmed and seasoned over here, so you can see that it's got a nice dark rich color, so it's going to go really well with our onions. But I've already gone ahead and seasoned it up properly, so that way we know that our liquid is going to be where it needs to be. Okay, now for the amount that we're going to be using, we're going to need roughly about, to make a half gallon of soup, we're going to need about 3 quarts or so of liquid, because once we get all these things together into the pot, we're going to let them simmer for a while so all these flavors can marry, and during that simmering process the stock is going to reduce down, so we're going to lose volume. So you always have to compensate for what you know you're going to lose through the cooking process. So if we know we want a half a gallon of stock, we need to up the ante by about 25% or so. So that same ratio would go for like a gallon of stock. You're going to need about a quart additional to that, and so on and so forth. You can see our onions and wine have reduced down beautifully, so I'm just going to quickly get our stock into our pot here. Like I said, we're going to be doing roughly 3 quarts of stock going into this dish. So there's our first one. So we could eyeball this, but just trying to keep some precision so you can kind of compare the before and after effects of working with this all properly. And one of the main elements, the reason why I like to keep the stock warm is not only to keep it at a safe temperature, but we don't want to kill the temperature of our pot. We want this to come up pretty quickly from the state that it's currently at, so that way it can simmer and cook faster. So always when working with stock, you want to make sure that it's at temperature, and that way that you can gauge the seasoning as well. When the stock is cold, it tends to not taste the way it's properly intended to taste from a seasoning perspective. Heating stuff up is going to make the saltiness come out a little bit more and bring out those flavors a little bit more. So it's very important for testing the seasoning of a warm stock at that warm state, because when it's cold, it's going to always taste bland, and you may end up over seasoning if you go from that point. So we've got our stock in here nicely. Just going to stir this up a little bit. I'm going to give it a quick taste just to make sure that we're on par with our seasoning. Gonna add a little bit more, not too much. A little bit of both here. Okay. And we're gonna toss in our 2 dry bay leaves. And so once this comes up to a simmer, we're going to cover it and just let it cook for about 30 to 45 minutes or so. All right, so now that our soup is simmering, what I want to do next is actually get our croutons prepped for our soup. So really one of the main treats of this dish is the dry old bread that gets put into the soup itself. It soaks up the soup, turns it into a whole different experience, as well as the addition of the cheese in a little bit. But I'm going to show you how to make some really delicious croutons right here in a pan. So it's going to be sort of similar to a grilled cheese in that regard, but we're going to melt down our butter here a little bit. So we don't want too much butter in here. It's just the perfect amount. And what we're going to do is just get our pieces of bread here. So I've just got some some baguette that I'm using here, a French baguette. So what we want to do is just get a nice golden brown on both sides. So we're cooking our pieces of baguette over a medium heat, medium low, medium high heat, anywhere in there. So you want to just keep adjusting it to make sure that you have the right temperature going on in the pan. And what we're just really looking to do is get some nice browning on our bread. Add some depth of texture, so when we put it into the soup a little bit later on, it's not just going to fall apart and disintegrate. We want it to hold together a little bit and have a nice piece of soppy bread for the customer to enjoy, along with the beautiful Gruyere cheese that we're going to be adding at the very end. Okay, so our croutons are just about ready to flip. We got some beautiful coloration on the bottom there, that deep rich color, and the butter soaked in there. It's going to be absolutely delicious to go with the savoriness and the sweetness of our soup. So we just want to toast up the other side. And what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to put a little bit of the cheese right on here on that first side that we did. Now, one of the main reasons that I really like doing these croutons in the pan is because any of you that watching that have ever worked in a kitchen know that the thing that is burned almost all the time in a restaurant is the croutons, because typically in a restaurant, out of sight means out of mind. So putting croutons into the oven even with a timer, people forget about them, and half hour later you start to smell that burnt bread. It's always good to have things right in front of you when you're finishing them. Also, I think it has a little bit better eatability to it once you do it in the pan. It's like topping a little grilled cheese inside of your soup, so kind of getting the best of both worlds. All right, so now that our soup has come back up to a simmer, what we're going to do is we're going to cover it, get a nice secure lid, and just put it on a nice low heat. Let that simmer for about 30 to 35 minutes. We want those flavors to combine together. We want to build a nice flavorful soup. And like I said before, that liquid is going to reduce down a little bit and really help intensify those flavors. So about 30-35 minutes, we'll have some beautiful French onion soup ready to serve. So our croutons are looking perfect. We've got some nice browning on top. We melted down a little bit of cheese because even though we're going to add more cheese on top later on, doesn't hurt to have a little bit more. So we're just going to set these off to the side and wait for our plating of our soup right at the end. All right, so our soup is perfect and ready to go. It's been simmering now for about 35 minutes. So it's reduced quite a bit. It's concentrated those flavors. We've allowed the onion and the wine and all those elements to come together really nicely. So what we're gonna do now is we're just gonna give it one quick taste to test our seasoning, make sure we're good there. Perfect. Does not need anything at all. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do a quick plating on this. Now, what I've got going on right here is we've already got our croutons seared off, ready to go. We've got our cheese in waiting. We've got a nice deep bowl to use for this. So any type of hearty vessel that you can use to hold the soup is important, because it needs to be able to go into the oven. So we need to be able to heat this. So using just a simple glass bowl or a paper bowl is never going to work for this. You want to have a nice piece of china, porcelain, so that way you can put it into the oven and melt your cheese and make it nice and gooey. So we're gonna go ahead and serve up our soup here. Make sure we get plenty of onion in there. Perfect. Let's see. So I'm just gonna put on a quick glove so I can assemble this. You can see the rich color of our onions in there. We're just gonna pop in our croutons here. Perfect size. Now we're going to cover all of this glory with our Gruyere cheese. So the cheese that we're adding, the Gruyere, is very sharp, but it has a lot of nice wine qualities to it. At least that's the way that I taste it and perceive it. Has some nice acidity to it, and it's gonna go really well with all of this. So we're not going to be shy. We're gonna put a good amount because we wanna build a decent crust on top of this, so that way it melts all the way across. That way it's visible, so we want it to get all up in there. So we're using about half a cup on here, so a decent sized portion, but it's all gonna come together really nicely. Perfect. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get this onto our sheet tray. We're just gonna pop this under our broiler. So we've got the broiler on a pretty high setting, so this shouldn't take very long at all to cook down. So I'm just gonna let it sit in there. Should only take about a minute or so to get that cheese nice and bubbly and caramelized. In a couple minutes, we'll get it out of the oven. We'll show you what it looks like. All right, so we're just gonna let it go for a little bit more. I just wanna give a quick update so you can kind of see the coloration we're getting on there, getting some nice coloring there. That's exactly what we're looking for. So we're just gonna get it back in that oven for a few more minutes or so and just wait for that magic. You can see all that beautiful caramelization. It's all nice and bubbly. It's just what we're looking for. All right, our soup is perfect. You wanna be very careful as it's gonna be scorching hot coming right out of the oven, just the way we want it. Put it onto our little serving plate. And there you have it. And there you have it. Beautiful classic French onion soup. Enjoy.